At the dawn of the 16th century, Lisbon was no longer just a European city. It had turned its back on the continent, its gaze fixed outward, across the vast, unconquered horizon of the Atlantic Ocean. For Lisbon, the Atlantic had become its main street, the very heart of its existence. By 1500, this city was the command center for the largest maritime network the world had ever seen. It was the headquarters of an empire not of land, but of water, a fluid chain of ports, fortresses, and sea routes stretching from Brazil to India, from Africa to the far corners of Southeast Asia. Lisbon was the node where all the world's currents converged. The Tagus River was the city's true heart. Its wide, deep channel welcomed the largest ships of the age, serving as a bustling harbor, a marketplace, a customs gate, and a shipyard all at once. Every morning, a forest of sails filled the river. Giant carracks, returning from year-long voyages to India, arrived with their hulls practically bursting with pepper, cinnamon, silks, porcelain, and gold. Smaller vessels set off for Africa, laden with cloth and wine, returning with raw materials and, tragically, with enslaved people. Other ships carried settlers and soldiers to a newly discovered land called Brazil, a territory still shrouded in mystery. Lisbon wasn't just wealthy, it was central. For the first time, a single city held the keys to the major trade circuits of 3 continents. Venice, once the gatekeeper of Eastern trade, had been bypassed. By charting a course around Africa, Portugal broke the old monopolies and forged a new axis of globalization, with Lisbon at its very pivot. The city's population exploded. Merchants from Genoa, Florence, and London established communities. Financiers managed vast sums of credit. Sailors, shipbuilders, cartographers, and clerks flooded the streets, creating a mosaic of languages. You could hear Portuguese, Arabic, Italian, and African tongues all in the same breath at the bustling docks. But the empire that brought Lisbon such immense wealth also made it profoundly brutal. Slavery was not on the fringes. It was woven into the fabric of daily life. By the early 1500s, a significant portion of Lisbon's population was enslaved Africans. They worked in the port, built the city's grand structures, and served in elite households. They carried goods through the streets, cleaned palaces, and rowed ships. Lisbon became one of the first European cities where racial difference was visibly inscribed into the urban landscape. The empire was global, but its human cost was concentrated in the bodies moving through the capital's streets. At the center of this sprawling system was King Manuel I. His reign marked the absolute peak of Portuguese maritime expansion. He ruled less like a king and more like the CEO of a global corporation, making decisions about fleet deployments, trade regulations, and strategic choke points in Africa and Asia. Manuel poured enormous sums into symbolic architecture. The Geronimo's monastery rose as a testament to imperial power, its stone carved with ropes, anchors, and exotic plants. Even God was redesigned to be a god of navigation and conquest. Nearby, the Tower of Belém stood guard at the mouth of the Tagus, a fortress and ceremonial gateway through which every ship entering or leaving the empire had to pass. Lisbon had become a controlled interface between Europe and the rest of the planet. Yet, for all its global power, Lisbon's physical structure was fragile. The city had grown too fast. Medieval streets twisted through crowded neighborhoods. Buildings were tall, narrow, and poorly built. There was no modern sanitation. Waste was simply thrown into the alleys and the river. Fires were common, and disease spread with alarming speed. The city feasted on global abundance, but it was architecturally on the brink. In 1531, disaster struck. A massive earthquake shook the city to its foundations, followed by a tsunami that surged up the Tagus. Entire neighborhoods collapsed. Thousands were killed. For a moment, it seemed the imperial capital might be erased. But Lisbon rebuilt, the empire's wealth was still immense. The docks were repaired, palaces were restored, and business resumed. The catastrophe was seen as a temporary setback, not a fundamental warning. Faith in divine protection and imperial destiny was unshaken. Over the following decades, the city was repeatedly hit by plague. The outbreaks in the 1560s and 70s were devastating, killing tens of thousands. Yet again, Lisbon endured. The ships kept coming, the empire kept functioning, and the city learned to live with catastrophe. However, beneath the surface, the system was starting to decay. By the late 16th century, Portugal's dominance in Asia was under attack. The Dutch and English arrived in the Indian Ocean with better ships and more aggressive tactics. Portuguese fortresses fell, trade routes were disrupted. The spice monopoly that had built Lisbon's fortune began to crumble. The empire was overextended, lacking the manpower and financial depth to defend its vast, scattered territories. Then, in 1580, the Portuguese monarchy itself collapsed. A dynastic crisis left the throne vacant, and Spain's King Philip II seized the opportunity, absorbing Portugal into the Spanish Empire. For Lisbon, this was a profound change. The city remained wealthy, but it lost its strategic autonomy. It was now part of the Iberian Union, governed from Madrid. Portuguese interests were subordinated to Spanish wars. Lisbon became a target for Spain's enemies, England and the Netherlands. Trade declined further, and the city's global role weakened. For 60 years, Lisbon existed in a state of suspended sovereignty. It was still an imperial capital, but no longer the brain of its own empire. The world was reorganizing, and Lisbon was being pushed to the margins as Amsterdam and London rose to prominence. In 1640, a coup restored Portugal's independence. Lisbon was once again the capital of a sovereign nation, but the world had changed. The Asian Empire was largely lost. The future of Portuguese power now lay across the Atlantic, in Brazil. Sugar plantations and gold discoveries in the colony became the new source of Lisbon's wealth. The city entered the late 17th century in transition. It was no longer the uncontested center of the world, but a peripheral node in a new global system. And yet, Lisbon remained a city of incredible complexity and life. Its streets were a theater of contradictions, imperial grandeur alongside urban poverty, solemn religious processions next to slave markets, aristocratic palaces towering over overcrowded slums. It was a city that had seen the world before the world had fully seen itself. By 1700, Lisbon was no longer the capital of the future. It had become the capital of memory, a city that had once held the arteries of the planet in its grasp, and now lived with the long, complicated consequences of having been the first to do so. At the beginning of the 18th century, Lisbon still believed itself to be a city favored by history. The Portuguese Empire no longer dominated the oceans as it once had, but it had not collapsed. Instead, it had reorganized itself around a new source of wealth, Brazil. Gold discoveries in Minas Gerais, followed by diamonds and agricultural expansion, produced a massive flow of resources across the Atlantic. Lisbon once again became a city flooded with colonial riches. Gold arrived daily in guarded convoys. It passed through the customs houses of the Ribeira and into the royal treasury. The crown taxed heavily, and the aristocracy prospered. Churches were decorated with gold leaf, palaces multiplied across the hills. Religious institutions accumulated wealth beyond imagination. Lisbon regained the appearance of abundance, even if its strategic position in the world had weakened. This second golden age did not produce a modern city. It produced a Baroque one. Wealth was spent on ornament, not infrastructure. Urban planning remained medieval. Streets were narrow, crooked, and overcrowded. Buildings were tall, poorly supported, and stacked densely on unstable hillsides. Fire hazards were extreme. Sanitation was primitive. The city was rich in appearance and deeply fragile in structure. The social order of Lisbon remained rigid. At the top stood the monarchy and nobility, followed by clergy, merchants, and bureaucrats. Below them existed a massive urban poor, laborers, dock workers, artisans, servants, and enslaved people. Slavery had not disappeared. Enslaved Africans and their descendants continued to perform much of the city's manual labor, even as Enlightenment ideas about human rights began to circulate in Europe. Religion still dominated public life. Processions filled the streets, churches regulated morality. The Inquisition continued to operate, policing beliefs and behavior. Lisbon was outwardly modernizing, but internally conservative, anchored in a worldview that combined imperial nostalgia with religious absolutism. Then, on the morning of November 1st, 1755, the city was destroyed. The earthquake that struck Lisbon that day was one of the most powerful ever recorded in Europe. The ground shook violently for several minutes. Entire districts collapsed instantly. Churches fell on their congregations, palaces disintegrated. The city's dense medieval core turned into rubble within moments. Survivors fled toward the river, seeking open space, but the disaster was not over. The sea suddenly withdrew from the Tagus, exposing the riverbed. Minutes later, a massive tsunami surged inland, drowning thousands and destroying what remained of the lower city. Fires broke out across the ruins and burned uncontrollably for days. By the time the catastrophe ended, Lisbon had effectively ceased to exist. 2/3 of the city was gone. Tens of thousands were dead. The administrative center of the Portuguese state had been erased. The psychological impact was as severe as the physical one. Across Europe, philosophers and theologians debated the meaning of the disaster. Lisbon became a symbol of cosmic injustice. How could God destroy one of the most devout Catholic capitals on a holy day? The earthquake triggered a crisis in religious explanations of history. It accelerated the rise of secular thought. Rebuilding Lisbon fell to Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, later known as the Marquis of Pombal. His response was revolutionary. He rejected traditional religious interpretations and adopted a rational, technocratic approach. His famous instruction was simple: bury the dead, feed the living, and rebuild the city. Pombal abolished the old medieval layout. The ruins were cleared systematically. A new city was designed from scratch, the Baixa district. Streets were laid out in a grid. Buildings were standardized in height and structure. New construction techniques were developed, including wooden internal frameworks designed to absorb seismic shocks. Lisbon became one of the first cities in the world rebuilt according to scientific and engineering principles. The city shifted from organic medieval chaos to rational Enlightenment order. Architecture became political. The new Lisbon represented not divine will, but human control over nature. Pombal also restructured society. He reduced the power of the nobility and the church. He expelled the Jesuits. He modernized education and administration. Lisbon became the center of a centralized, secular, bureaucratic state. But modernization came with authoritarian control. Pombal ruled through repression, censorship, and surveillance. The rebuilt city was efficient, but not free. Lisbon became an early example of the modern administrative capital: rational, centralized, controlled. In the early 19th century, Lisbon faced another shock. During the Napoleonic Wars, French armies invaded Portugal. The royal family fled to Brazil, effectively relocating the capital of the empire across the Atlantic. Lisbon was occupied, looted, and politically sidelined. For the first time in its history, Lisbon was not the center of Portuguese power. When the monarchy returned, Portugal had changed. Brazil declared independence in 1822. Removing the largest and most valuable colony, Lisbon lost its main economic engine. The empire was reduced to scattered territories in Africa and Asia with limited profitability. The city entered a long period of economic stagnation and political instability. Industrialization arrived slowly and unevenly. Factories appeared along the river. Railways connected Lisbon to the interior. Gas lighting, public transport, and new infrastructure began to transform urban life. A new social class emerged, the urban middle class. Merchants, professionals, engineers, journalists, and civil servants reshaped the cultural landscape. Cafes became centers of political debate. Newspapers spread new ideas. Liberalism, nationalism, and republicanism challenged traditional authority. The monarchy weakened, coups, revolts, and constitutional crises became frequent. Lisbon became a city of demonstrations, protests, and conspiracies. The old imperial identity collapsed, replaced by a search for a new national purpose. By the late 19th century, Lisbon was no longer an imperial capital. It was a semi-industrial European city struggling to modernize. Its population grew, but its wealth lagged behind Northern Europe. Poverty expanded in working-class districts. Slums formed on the hills. Public health crises persisted. At the same time, the city acquired new symbols of modernity. Avenues were widened, parks were built, electric trams appeared. Public schools, theaters, and museums emerged. Lisbon began to resemble a modern capital, even if it remained economically peripheral. By 1900, Lisbon stood between worlds. It was no longer the city that ruled the oceans. It was not yet the city of mass democracy. It had survived empire, catastrophe, occupation, and decline. What remained was a city learning to exist without imperial destiny, forced to define itself not as the center of the world, but as one city among many in a rapidly industrializing Europe.